So when it comes to actually implementing zero trust at an enterprise scale or at an enterprise level, we start to run into some problems like the fact that we have many sites with many mesh instances. There's not just one. We have many endpoints for services. They're often replicated geographically, as well as for policy reasons. Things like I have my EU data center with data locked there for GDPR, and that's separate from the US data centers, for example. It can become very challenging in this heterogeneous world to reason about policy. That's why identity-based policy is so key, right? Um, Similarly, it's hard for us to have policy at a single layer because of the heterogeneity of our environment. We can't just like spend a bunch of money on AWS security auditing and AWS security best practices and like set everything up super tight, because then tomorrow we turn around and we acquire a company that's running in GCP, right? And like we can't afford the cost in agility in that acquisition company to make them migrate over to AWS, for example, to fit with our security best practices, right? This is something we see all the time. So policies at a single level are painful, hard to manage, and it's impractical to use a single cloud to enforce those policies, which is why it's attractive to do something like service mesh to implement some of these policies as well. As we're looking then at some of the policy choices, network level policy is what we've been using for decades now, and it is great, but it is brittle and it starts to fall apart today because of the highly dynamic environments that we're living in. And secondly, it makes it hard to do things all the way down to the workspace, to the individual workload level, right? We want to be able to do things like authenticate and authorize at every single hop. It's intractable to write and keep the network policy up to date to allow that, or at least it's very challenging using traditional tools. Solely identity-based policy can also be hard to administer. And this is even the new fancy stuff with the service mesh can be very challenging. And that's because we have different identity systems across our providers, just like we have different policy engines. AWS has its own notion of identity separate from GCP's, separate from our data center on-prem, and unifying and understanding what is an identity across those domains is incredibly challenging. And that can make writing simple identity-based policy like the service mesh would like you to do challenging because, for example, does a service have the same runtime identity when it's deployed in AWS and in Azure? It can if you're very, very careful, but oftentimes it would not, right? And so challenges like that make it very hard to write service identity-based policy alone in the same way that writing network-based policy alone is very challenging. And then finally, we have to remember today's regulatory environment as well. We can't just rip out firewalls as much as we would like to, or I personally would like to. One, because there's value in defense in depth, but two, because auditors and regulators today understand a network perimeter based model and expect that in many highly regulated places. This is starting to be relaxed across places like, for example, the Air Force and the DoD. We see, a move towards identity-based policy and a reduced emphasis on network perimeter controls. They're not gone, but just reduced emphasis there. We can make a trade-off between the two. And that is exactly getting into this idea of multi-tiered policies. And this is kind of the second key idea that we introduce in this SP. The idea that we expect that we're going to be living in a world with policies at different levels that are going to be overlaying. And again, this is not new. This is the world we've been living in, but we're trying to put names to these things so we can start to talk about them as a group. At least two layers, network tier and identity tier, we just talked about. To give you an idea of a third tier, I often talk about application tier policies. These are the kinds of policies that, for example, like a Spring Cloud Gateway is implementing. Does the request payload that came in conform to the schema of my service? This is some of the stuff that we might use for OPA to decide. Are these values in the request allowable? If we think about the case, for example, of OPA gatekeeper, which is limiting what configuration can be pushed to a kube API server. That's exactly application level policy for Kubernetes applications. It's governing which values can you set in the configuration. Because Kubernetes RBAC is governing, are you allowed to write the config or not? Gatekeeper is governing, does the config have a correct value? That's an example of an application tier policy, but is out of the scope for what we want to talk about in this SP. And so in this SP, we're really honing in on network tier and identity tier policies. Having these live together, having network policy and identity policy, relaxing some of the network policy because we're augmenting it with identity-based policy that we didn't have before, is realistic and it's non-destructive. Right. And I'll show some patterns that we commonly stamp out to help achieve this. And the biggest one is using something like Envoy egress and ingress gateways on either side of a firewall. For example, maybe service one lives in one data center in one cloud and service two lives in the other. And we have firewalls that separate the two. We have network segmentation that separates the two. And the challenge that we have is anytime we want to consume a new service across that boundary, we need to update rules, and rules are updated pairwise, right? Becomes very challenging to maintain, becomes very brittle. I'm sure a bunch of folks that are in old school organizations have the firewall team and they put in this request and somebody goes to a spreadsheet and looks at the allocated CIDRs and makes a decision on, am I going to approve this policy update or not? That's incredibly common across industry. One of the patterns that we see regularly that we have started to stamp out is, rather than having a highly dynamic set of firewall rules, we instead deploy envoys on either side. We instantiate a static set of firewall policies that say that the workloads for the envoys are allowed to talk across the DMZ, across the gap. And then we use identity-based policy to describe who is allowed to go over that tunnel, the tunnel that effectively exists between that pair of envoys over the firewall. And in this way, we can have identity-based policy on the inside, on the left side with service one and its dependencies. We can have identity-based policy on the right side with service two and its dependencies, but they are allowed to easily traverse the network underneath. And often leveraging the service mesh, we can make this traversal transparent. But from an organizational perspective, we really didn't give up meaningful security. We still have our inbound outbound firewall rules, but we've augmented them with identity-based policy on what is allowed to go over this set of gateways. And if we drill down to this just one more, here's just an example. I like to try and illustrate why it is these L7 policies are powerful. If we look at some of the lower level policies, they're very piecemeal and they are not contextful, right? Having CIDRs and things like that in a policy are challenging to read and to understand. And the two halves, whatever's happening on the left side and whatever's happening on the right side, are disconnected. Identity-based policy using the mesh, we can start to instantiate kind of global policies that make sense everywhere. We can express that intent, service one is allowed to call service two. We can express the intent that service two is exposed for consumption from a specific place. And then maybe we would need policy per link to route the traffic to that specific place, those mesh routing rules. Hopefully this would be something that we would start to automate in our environments, right? But this kind of a thing, hopefully we can start to understand how policies are more readable and understandable in this world. It's easier to start to get a total view of what is allowed and what is not allowed. And it's easier to move faster. We get more agility in our ability to iterate and innovate because we're not being held up by things like the multi-week firewall update process. But still, the organization is not compromised in security.